tell me about what money is, what money was, and how we think about money today, and how we thought about it, say, in medieval and last millennium, and what is money? How do we think about it?
All right. Well, you're starting with a softball question then.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll give you a sort of abbreviated version. So the way that economists tend to think about the origins of money and the ontology of money is that, and this is the kind of story that you get from Adam Smith forward, and that's a story that starts with a society becoming increasingly complex, and there's division of labor, so that people are no longer self-sufficient. As they develop specific skills, they realize that it's advantageous to trade with one another and exchange one good for another. Initially, this is, according to the legend, this is done through barter, that people trade in kind with one another. After a while, people recognize that it would be better to have one commodity that serves as a universal equivalent, one commodity that's highly liquid, and exhibits certain advantages, like it's high value per unit, it's easily divisible, you can print a denomination on it, and of course, as we know, this was gold or silver that could play this role. So once society then agrees on what commodity is going to play this role as money, that reduces transaction costs for people in the economy, and they will all, without really needing a state, they will all kind of rush to gold or silver as the monetary medium, right? And then as this medium becomes more and more well accepted, a couple of 100 years down the road, people start realizing that they could substitute the gold and silver for paper. Not necessarily that they are removing gold and silver, but gold and silver moves to the background. So gold and silver is backing the paper money, but because of the inconvenience of running around with gold and silver, it's better to have paper receipts for those gold and silver nuggets, right, or coins, and then we start transacting with paper money. So that's it, kind of the basic story that you get in the econ textbook. Right. Now, you mentioned before that you're a big fan of David Graeber's work in Debt, the First 5,000 Years. So he's picking up on an anthropological conception of money that starts in a very different direction. So, right. So for the, yeah, go ahead.
Just jump in there. So that's the conception of money that we often hear, say, from economists, but you and others in sort of the field of history and anthropology might have a problem with that story. Is that right?
Yeah. So I mean, it's a very nice story. It's very logical. It's deductive. It's soothing in that sense. But as most anthropologists and historians suggest, it doesn't necessarily track reality particularly well. So instead of thinking of money emerging as a medium of exchange, Graeber and others, myself included, would probably suggest that money first emerges as a measure of value. Now, I'll just tell you very briefly what that means. So from an anthropological point of view, when people start cohabiting in societies, however small, there's sort of a constant interaction between people in which they give and take. Even in a conversation, you can think about a conversation as a form of commerce, where we're exchanging words, we're exchanging meaning with each other. And there's a kind of recognition that this ought to be a reciprocal domain in which we are giving sort of gifts to each other. It could be expressions of affection, it could be hints, it could be information, but that ordinary discourse between people is a form of gift giving. You can think about this also in terms of useful things that might be created in a community, that people in a tightly knit community or let's say the family even today, that you do things for each other on a daily basis, but that there's an underlying economy of reciprocity that's essential to the family, or essential to small communities way back when.
Right.
There is no necessarily universal unit of account or measure of value initially, but as society grows and grows, and this gift giving is ongoing, there's a recognition that you might want to denominate your indebtedness to someone as coming up with some kind of standard or unit of value. So David Graeber argues that that really is the origins of money, and that the coins and initially there weren't really coins in ancient Greece, but like ignits and little nuggets, but eventually you get to coins, and that he argues was a way to represent the indebtedness that you incur in transacting with other people. So instead of just saying, I owe you $6 of commodities, you're now actually finding a way to represent that indebtedness. And he argued that really starts when societies grow to the point where people are anonymous. And he argued in particular that it becomes prominent once you have states that are essentially imperialist, that are encroaching upon other areas, and they're forced to engage in transactions in a world with very low trust. Right.
Thank you. So it's making me, if I understand you correctly, money kind of, before it emerges at all, you could say it comes out of the natural reciprocity that we might have in a society and amongst people we know, and that rather than money sort of instantaneously needing to emerge because we're so specialized and we need to do it to run an economy, actually, no, it kind of actually emerges out of natural credit and debt relations. So would you be able to then put that story in, why then would people with other sort of theories of money have it wrong? Or is there a way we can talk about normative value of money? Like how should we think about money then, given that story?
Well, so this is where you run into the problem that there isn't any one right way of thinking about money, because money means so many different things. And each theory of the economy has its associated understanding of money. So if you were to talk about neoclassical economics, right, money there becomes kind of a way to reduce transaction costs. It becomes a way to communicate utility, becomes a way to communicate profits. It becomes the dialogic, it becomes the discursive framework in which the market functions. If you look at it from a Marxist point of view, in which value denotes denotes social control and social power, in that setting or from that point of view, money is about power. It's about on the one hand, kind of a reward for successful imposition of power and control over others, but so it becomes kind of congealed power. So if you then hold money, that means that you can command resources and people in the world. So the point here that's really important to make is that money is not a thing in itself, and we're never going to understand money in itself. So we're always going to come at it from different types of theories. It could be anthropological theories in the case of Graeber, Marcel Mauss, many sort of French structuralists who fit into that definition. Or you come at it from a Marxist point of view or a neoclassical point of view, and money makes perfect sense in all of these elaborations. It's just that we can't merge all of those stories and make sense of them in any particular way.
That's a very helpful answer, Carl, because that makes me realize that, okay, we have to think about money in the context, and there is, in a way, at least definitely no easy way to answer how should we think about money or what money should be. I'm wondering if, to change directions here, if you could take me to another context where money was used, an interesting context, which is, you write about around 16th century, 17th century England, and how there money was kind of transitioning towards credit money. So would you be able to just take me to England at that time? Why was that an interesting period, as there was a rising sort of industrial revolution, a financialization after that?
Sure. So what happens then, and I'll connect it to the kind of Graeber story. So as states become more and more prominent in the economies of, in particular, Europe, and are trying also to make sure that the economy works for the state, right? So commerce becomes an interest of state. Also, they realize that rulers, kings, queens, realize if they can control the currency, they can manipulate the currency for their own benefit. So you can devalue the coin, you can, cut off a little piece of it, melt it down. You issue coins that everyone thinks is full-bodied, but it really turns out that it's got a few ounces less in each, so that you can actually mint more coins. So there was a way that statesmen manipulated the currency. Also, of course, they were desperate for more currency, more money, so that they could fund their imperial pursuits. And of course, much of the quest for empire, in particular in the beginning, was to find sources of gold and silver, whether in Mexico or in Peru, or the mythology of El Dorado, right? Everyone's trying to find this vast store or treasure of gold and silver that they could turn into imperial power. So what happens in the 17th century is that there's had been a large influx of silver, in particular, through the Spanish Empire, that had kind of flooded the European market. There's a price increase. So if there's more money around and the same amount of goods, prices will go up. But what happens as you move into the 17th century, there's a kind of a proto-capitalist society emerging, and production, the quantity of production starts to rise pretty significantly. And what happens in that setting is, if you don't have a proportional inflow of new gold and silver, is that there's a scarcity of money that emerges. Right. So this is in the 17th century that on everyone's minds, and there's downturns in the economy. It's called the general crisis of the 17th century, and a lot of the political economic writers at the time were desperate to find a way to attract more money. The key was to export more than you imported, so there's a surplus that was settled in gold and silver. And people like Thomas Munn and Gerard Malines made that the kind of centerpiece. So that's the kind of backstory.
Right.
So one of the solutions that a group called the Hartlib Circle suggested was that we can use alchemy, right? So why don't we just use state-of-the-art knowledge of chemistry, or what was called alchemy at the time, which was a well-respected integral part of the scientific revolution. So let's try to use alchemy to turn lead into gold, and let's make sure that this is a very guarded secret. So almost all kings and queens in 17th century Europe had their own court alchemists, busy at work trying to find the recipe to the philosopher's stone, so that they and only they had the power to create money. So unfortunately that fails. But what this Hartlib Circle group suggests is that if we just start using paper money, right, then we can actually solve the scarcity of money problem, right? And paper money can work as a form of alchemy. And this is not fiat money, this is credit money that they had in mind. And the difference between the two is that they required that the paper was backed by something. Could be backed by gold and silver, a fractional reserve in the vault of a bank, or it could be future revenues from trade, or it could be future tax revenue. So that the paper would be redeemable in the future for something of real value. And the idea here then is that people need to start to trust these paper notes and to accept them in payment, to the point that it becomes kind of ingrained in their mind that these paper notes represent stable valuations. So this is the kind of thinking that then went into the creation of the Bank of England that was formed in the 1690s, and they started to issue paper notes, initially a very high denomination. So it was mostly just the state and merchants and the military that transacted in these paper notes. But very quickly, it started to be issued not just by the Bank of England, but also regional banks. And then bit by bit, we get to the point where credit money substituted for silver and gold coins pretty quickly.
Okay. So this is great. So I would love to get into how we get into this. You could even call it a kind of alchemy, as we start to create paper money, and then that becomes untethered from actual metal monies, and we start creating fiat monies. But just to situate ourselves sort of in this period, I'm wondering if you could just tell me a bit more about alchemy, what it was, and why and how people sort of lived in that worldview, and why people thought that they might want to actually literally create more gold in the first place.
Yeah. So alchemy, I mean, it's sort of in some ways at the center of capitalism. It's about creating something out of nothing. It's about taking what they perceive to be God's gift to humanity. This idea that nature is constantly working for the benefit of humanity. They looked at the kind of fecundity of nature as being almost infinite, and that if you investigated the inner workings of nature, the causalities that operate in nature, that you can use them for human benefit. So, for example, why is it that a seed can grow in the soil and become a plant? How is it that it can obtain nutrients from the ground through the roots and benefit from rainwater? And by actually understanding that very process, drawing on the scientific philosophy of science of Francis Bacon, it was about gaining control over nature and using this kind of abundance of materiality and energy that was hidden in nature, that you can then turn that into something, you can transform or transmute that into wealth that we can enjoy. So, for example, Newton was an alchemist, and quite well regarded. Well, it used to be a secret because historians of science didn't want to let that on, because being an alchemist was sort of seen unscientific, and Newton was trying to be constructed as the father of science, and having him dabble in alchemy wasn't perceived as serious. But now it's well recognized that he was looking for the kind of inner workings of nature and the invisible forces. That's why he discovered gravity. I mean, you can't touch gravity. You have to understand the force, and of course be able to utilize it for human benefit. So alchemy is really, it was part of this spirit of capitalism that's about the conquest of nature, not just imperialism, right, which was certainly there, but there's an intensive conquest of nature that people from the 17th century onwards are looking to find ways to manipulate nature in a way that allows us to extract its useful components. So it's completely instrumentalized by humanity.
So that's, the reason why I kind of wanted to touch more on alchemy is that I think it's a really awesome thread for your work, because, you have an article about money being the philosopher's stone, and when you realize, oh wait, it's something which actually in a way we can kind of transmute into anything we like. It's really interesting, but it's not just an interesting idea. It's very grounded in the fact that quite literally alchemy was very prominent in that time, and it's what science emerged from. And they genuinely, through your work, you can see they had a scarcity of money, so alchemy is genuinely quite needed for them. So I'm wondering if you could maybe touch on, and maybe we can get them back into credit and how they start creating these kind of paper monies, because I'm interested in how that perspective of capitalism and how we can start, say, trying to use the world more instrumentally and trying to create things out of nothing. How does that progress out of alchemy? I'm interested in that worldview. How does that sort of develop out of this period?
Yeah, so I think so this kind of connection between credit and alchemy and the origins of economic growth, the idea of thinking about the world as a cornucopia available for our exploitation. Much of that continues into the 18th and 19th and 20th century as I think the kind of the logic of capitalism. But it's important also to point out that the link between credit and alchemy changed radically in the beginning of the 18th century, because what happens with the founding of the Bank of England, which is called the Financial Revolution, we also have the creation of a generally circulating credit currency. And we also have a stock market emerging where both bonds and stocks, in particular the stocks in the Bank of England and East India Company, are traded, and a little bit later on also shares in the South Sea Company. Of course, that the South Sea Company is what we associate with the first stock market crash. So the South Sea Company was the share prices were bid up astronomically in the year of 1720, and then within the span of 2 months, pretty much all of the value disappeared. So this is a moment when people start saying, well, this was the dream of alchemists. This is not serious. They try to actually vilify credit and alchemy at the same time. And at this point, the word alchemy becomes a kind of foil for something that is a pipe dream. And instead, alchemists change the nomenclature to being about chemistry, or initially chemistry with a Y, and then later on chemistry. But so there's that connection is sort of interesting in itself. But what you're suggesting, and what I think you're absolutely right, is that if you think about the origins of economic growth, it's partly about great ideas, right? But most importantly, it's about scientific developments that are useful to transforming nature, contorting nature, manipulating nature in a way that we can make it do what we want. So even if you think about a cell phone, I mean, cell phone is obviously the software is a bunch of fantastic ideas on what consumers want, etc. But fundamentally, it's about actually using different materials from nature to make it do things for us that we want. And quantum mechanics, I mean, the whole, the critical issue is connectivity, right? And finding the ways where there's kind of an efficient transference of power and storing of power, and so that kind of, the idea that economic growth stems from really working inside of nature and inside of molecules, inside of atoms. I mean, that is in some ways the microcosm of the macrocosm, right? The connection between the small and the large, the connection between, the real innovations and economic growth. So, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I'm interested then in, like, to what degree you think that because you talk about alchemy there, it starts actually to get a bad name, and it's associated with the way you're just trying to create credit, and that's not going to work, and that's going to lead to stock market crashes. Do you think that there was an important way that the alchemical worldview was in a way a good thing? Like it's important. It was about, you know, Francis Bacon and trying to create progress. So to what degree was it a good or a bad thing, that worldview, and how has that changed to
Well, I mean, that comes back to whether you think, you know, industrialization and economic growth is a good thing or a bad thing. And of course, you know, one can make the argument that it's really been an amazing thing in the last 2 years. But now we're facing the consequences of so much economic growth through biodiversity loss and climate change. So now we're sort of gotten to the maybe end point of benign economic growth. But if we go back to the 18th century, there's, you know, what I just said before, that there's a real recognition that nature is the custodian of an abundance of wealth, and we just have to figure out how to use it in a way that is useful to us, and in a way that we can create things that people want and that they're willing to pay for. And that we can turn nature into machines that can produce on an abundant scale, and that we incorporate more and more parts of the world into this kind of dynamism and engine for economic growth, with all the kind of genocide and enslavement and destruction that entailed. But so there is that kind of intensive and extensive conquest of nature, which, you know, is it good or bad? I mean, that's right. It all depends on from what point of view. The other aspect that I wanted to highlight is there's something really powerful about credit, because what credit does is that it moves value from the future to the present, right? And by moving the value from the future to the present, you can actually use that value today. You can either consume it or you can invest it. And of course, what capitalism is all about is that you move value from the future to today, and then you invest it to create the value in the future that allows you to pay that debt. So we're always kind of, we're bonded to the future. Right? We're forced to work hard and diligently in order to pay off our debts, but that creates abundance in the process. And so without credit, without being able to move value from the future to the present, if we always had to have retained earnings to pay for projects, very little would be done. So credit is in some ways what has enabled humanity to expand and to grow exponentially, which is a really weird period of history. Yeah. So for 99.9993% of the time that Homo sapiens have been, you know, on Earth, there's been no economic growth. It's just, I mean, this is what people refer to as the hockey stick effect, right? It's just flat, 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 and then we have exponential growth.
And was that due to credit, and did we not have the same kind of credit any time before this?
No, not at all the same kind of long-term credit, stable credit. The credits that you had in medieval times were frequently, you know, small-scale credit between individuals, between merchants. And you had, you know, rulers, kings and queens, princes, borrowing, but frequently failing in repayment. So there were small systems of credit, but not at all the kind of generalized ecology of credit that was introduced in the 17th century. So I would say that really important. I mean, the component parts is credit is important, science is important, imperialism is important.
In this context, it might be helpful if you talk a bit about your book Scarcity, because now I'm interested in how do people think about, and how did people think about what the natural world was and their relation to the natural world, right? So
Yeah.
what kind of worldview did you have in like medieval times, and what ways did that lead to them not having, you know, this kind of enormous economic growth, and how does that change?
Yeah, yeah. So I wrote this this book called Scarcity: A History from the Origins of Capitalism to the climate crisis, with Fredrik Albritton Jonsson, who's a historian at University of Chicago. And I guess for context, let me just move to the present a bit, because as anyone who's taken an econ class knows, the way that economics is taught is that you start with the principle of scarcity, that everything is scarce. Therefore, you have to make decisions. And when you make decisions, there are opportunity costs. And economics essentially is a decision science, where you do cost-benefit analysis on the basis of this. So that is one way of looking at the world. It's one way of looking at the relationship between economy and nature, between desires and nature. It's based on the idea that humanity is insatiable, that we always want more, not necessarily of the same goods, but we always want more and more enjoyment through consumption. It's also based on the idea of fungibility, that all commodities through the markets can be translated into one another. And then thirdly, it's based on the idea of infinite substitutability, so that if you start running low on any resources, you can just come up with inorganic alternatives from it. So science will always science will always come up with new solutions to the depletion of natural resources. So we are suggesting that, given that we're facing a resource exhaustion crisis, land use crisis, water crisis, climate change, biodiversity loss, that we're now stuck in a planetary scarcity in which we can't grow ourselves out of our problems. We can't use economic growth as the easy solution to economic, social, and political problems. So it's kind of a critique of the basic fundamental starting point of neoclassical economics, because we argue it forces you to think about the most efficient use and exploitation of resources at any given moment. And in extension, it also forces you to think about growth as a good, as an unqualified good, right? And again, we're not saying that economic growth has been bad all along. We're saying that now there's a tremendous amount of evidence suggesting that we've grown a bit too far, and that we really need to rethink what kind of growth we're engaged in. So we're not necessarily suggesting degrowth or the end of growth, but we need to be more cognizant of what type of economies we're creating, and essential to that is fundamentally, how do we think about the relationship to nature? Moving them back to the medieval, like other ways. So we divided up the world in, or the history of economic ideas into cornucopian ideas and finitarian ideas. So the cornucopian ideas are the ones in which people think of both nature and desires, nature and economy, almost like a double helix growing infinitely. Right. And the finitarian ideas is refers to thinkers and schools of thought who have thought of limits and boundaries, and who are thinking about society and nature as not being involved in an infinite growth process, but it's more about the kind of harmony between nature and the economy. And we go back to Aristotelian thinking in the 1500s. That's where we start the story. So we look at medieval ideas of you think about the 7 deadly sins. 5 of them are about restraining desires. It's supposed to be a sin to seek infinite enrichment. There's sumptuary laws that prevent people from consuming too much. Society was hierarchical, ordered, everyone had their place. There's no idea of progress. There's no idea of improvement. It's all about maintaining a kind of harmony between nature and society. Right? So that's a finitarian way of looking at the world. There's no abundance, so there's still scarcity, but it's thought of in very different ways. Another way, another school of thought that kind of embraces this is Romanticism. Nature for them existed as the kind of cornucopia of beauty, and nature is a space of the sublime. It's an organism that needs to be respected for itself. It's essential that humanity engages with nature for its own well-being, and happiness and health. So, nature is not the source of our infinite enrichment. It's rather a kind of a space for life, space for beauty, space for love, space for spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
So those are just two of the finitarian views that kind of counterpoints.
Thank you. I really enjoyed reading, not all of it, but the Scarcity is a great book because of the fact that you realize, oh wait, the way we say the way economics works actually rests on underlying assumptions, and it's not that say growth or anything's been bad, but it starts with questions that we have infinite wants and finite resources, but that's a framing, and it can and has been different. So that's been great to try and I'm interested in, and I know these are really difficult questions, in why we didn't move out of a time where we thought of these sort of finite world sort of philosophies, and how we didn't get economic growth for so long. I'm wondering what the role of alchemy and Christianity, or I'm just wondering if you have something to say on why it took so long and why we moved out of these kinds of sort of limited world sort of philosophies.
Yeah. Well, I guess again, you already said that's a really complicated question, but if I were to just wave my hands at it, I would say that that ideas really, really matter. And here I'm certainly biased as an intellectual historian, because I do think that ideas really shape the way we engage with the world, and the way that we think about possibilities in the world, and how we basically decide to organize our societies and assign roles to people therein. So if you have a society that's based on economic growth, well, then you have a university system, a elementary school system in which you're teaching people the lessons required to generate economic growth. But in medieval times, this is not necessarily high on the agenda. It's about people being taught that which is necessary for them to fulfill their duty to the polity, to the body politic. Medieval notions of society were frequently depicted with a body where the head was the king, the internal organs, the clergy and the aristocracy, the arms belonged to the artisans, the legs to the peasants, and the circulatory system was likened to the merchants. And everyone had a duty to do what was necessary to maintain health of the body politic. And so if one part grew too much, well, that would be considered kind of a cancer, and it would upset the delicate balance in society, right? So you need to break out of that way of thinking about the world, and you need to also break out of science being a way to prove the Bible right and to prove God's existence, right? You need to start thinking of science as a utilitarian, purposeful way to transform nature for wealth creation. You also need to have enough of a political revolution or loosening of political control so that a middle class can emerge who are both pursuing science and pursuing commerce. And what's interesting there is really, if you think about the Atlantic world that emerges in, let's say the 1600s or so, that it becomes kind of a world that's free from both church control and state control. And this is where, a middle class, merchants, financiers, are able to create a world, a different world, a different mental space that enabled for capitalism to kind of plant its seeds with all of its conflicts, right? With the removal of indigenous populations, the enslavement of Africans and indigenous populations, of course. But in that world, there's also the creation of corporations, of insurance companies, of credit, and that becomes a kind of a laboratory for capitalism that then became kind of incorporated in Europe and later in the United States, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, awesome. I wondered then, you talk about the importance of ideas, and you kind of need the ideas and the ability to think that you can do this and that you can create a world, say, improve the material world here. I'm wondering if you, more specifically, I'm interested in your ideas about, you talk about what kind of growth should we have in the future. I'm interested, sort of, given you've looked at a lot of this work, like what kind of economic world and broader world do you think we should have, appreciating that we obviously need humility to answer such complex questions, but I'm interested in your views here.
Well, I mean, so going back to the Scarcity book, then what we're facing now, first and foremost, is the recognition that it's not that we're running out of resources, although we are running out of resources as well. But what we're doing is that we're running out of sinks, right? And this is, as we're burning fossil fuels, carbon is being emitted into the atmosphere. The places that traditionally serve as sinks for that carbon, that absorbs the carbon, is the atmosphere, the oceans, and nature, forests. The problem is that we're burning so much of it that the sinks are full. So the carbon gets stuck in the atmosphere, and that has really deleterious effects on Earth systems. The nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, phosphorus cycles. And what we're generating there is the kind of fear of tipping points, right? So if you're, let's say, emitting a certain amount of carbon, there's a non-linear reaction to it. It's a disproportionate effect. There's also a sense that you're moving towards a moment where it's irreversible. So we can't really fix it. And that's, of course, the fear that we're upsetting the cycles and the systems in nature that maintain a stable climate that enables us to live in, sophisticated societies. So what we need to do is to figure out ways to continue to have a vibrant economy, because we are in some ways dependent upon, people being employed as a way to share the social wealth created. So we need to have a vibrant economy, but one that doesn't generate the kind of pollution and the kind of material effects that are generating these tipping points. So you could, for example, have a growth of service economies. You can have a growth of cyber economies. You can have a growth of intellectual commodities. That doesn't necessarily require, it's not as resource heavy. And we also need to find technological fixes and solutions like decarbonization, making that affordable enough. But it shouldn't be to fix things that we can continue as business as usual. We also need to think about, certain limits to our addiction to consumerism. And here is the issue that the problem that we're facing today is not the effect of humanity. It's the effect of a very small percentage of humanity over consuming. And in particular, it's, people in the country that I live in who have a huge footprint. And there has to be a kind of a pushback and a reduction in that in the ways in which wealthy societies and around the globe are acting and living in ways that are generating problems for all of humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, go ahead. So, I mean, that's not a potted, neat definition of what we need to do. So but that's, I refrain from being too prescriptive. And
that's helpful. Throughout this podcast, we've been also thinking about how, framing and how ideas impact what we do. And I'm interested, and as a historian, this might be a cool perspective, what kind of ideas in economics we might get wrong or we could adapt. For example, the ideas about scarcity could be one. I'm also interested, given David Graeber's work about should we really be valuing and thinking in terms of production and consumption? Should we, actually do people get value from production and actually don't we, actually care and reuse loads of goods? So I'm interested in maybe if you have any thoughts about how we should decide to value goods and what kinds of things we should prioritize in terms of trying to maybe not even create is the right word, but how should we try and think of a world in that sense?
Well, I mean, that's a very, very good question. I mean, David Graeber has a book that came out before his untimely passing, and if I don't, I think I've got it right, but I think the book is called Bullshit Jobs, where he is drawing on an autonomous Marxist tradition of thinking about work as a form of social control. That, what capitalism is about is that it's activating people, but in the process of doing so, what is really being done is the coordination and the organization and the ordering of society through work, so that life is, you have a couple of free years in before you go to kindergarten, but then once you start school, it's all about preparation for work, and then you spend a good 50 or so years working, and your whole existence is defined by work, and then you recover from work in your pension years, but you're basically sapped of any creative energy. So what he is suggesting is that capitalism is a massive machinery for social control through work. Another way of looking at that is that we're working in order to be able to enjoy all the bells and whistles of consumer capitalism. And that, the way economists think about us is that we're really kind of market beings, and we, sell a little bit of labor in order to buy some goods, and that the focus is really on us as consumers. And arguably, we've become so much better off in terms of how much we're able to consume and enjoy, that the time we spent working is considered to be a kind of a fair exchange for all the benefits that we get to enjoy. Now, if you were to reassess this, how much time do you really spend consuming and how much time do you spend working? Well, you consume very little of your awakened hour, and most of it is about work. Now, are we willing to sort of reassess the role of labor in our economy? I mean, labor is also the primary form of socialization, and we realized during the pandemic that we're kind of addicted to labor both as social beings. But is it really the way that we want to live our lives? Do we, and is it worth it in terms of, the payoff being consumption? I think that's the kind of entryway into that conversation where we need to start having a serious discussion about that. And I think we're going to be forced to do that anyways, as AI is going to replace tons of middle-class jobs.
Yeah, and I love that you bring up that book too, because it's not even that it's necessarily a trade-off of consumption and work. Sometimes we create work for ourselves and we have very useless things going on, or in a reciprocal cycle, we have to have more jobs because we're too overworked, so we need jobs to recuperate and things like this. So, well, do you have any, this has been a great podcast, Carl. Do you have any topics we didn't cover you wanted to cover, or any last things you wanted to say that you haven't?
No, I just thought it was very enjoyable, and the questions that you're asking are really excellent and kind of foundational question. And I think it's really refreshing to talk to students who are not stuck in a particular interpretive framework, but who dare, as you do, to ask these big questions, because once you buy too much into any particular theoretical paradigm, it becomes about puzzle solving, right? And it doesn't become about asking the questions that you as an individual or humanity that we need to pose. And so in that sense, going back to the Scarcity book that Fredrik and I wrote, it's really a book for I mean, the target audience is people like you who are thinking in these terms and who are refusing to accept the kind of dogma that parents and grandparents have imposed upon them. So what we need to solve the problems of the future is not the ways of thinking that brought us to this problem, right? We need new ways of thinking, and for that, we can't rely on these established ideas. We need new ideas, and people like you are the ones who to create those ideas.
Well, thank you for your compliments, Carl. Well, I'll put any links to your books and your work in the description of this video, and whatever else you let me know. Well, thank you very much.